I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is the fact that I am willing to talk about it. We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
I think the likelihood may be very high. And my evidence for it is just, it's a thought experiment, and it's simple. We'll just end with this reflection. And I'm elsewhere, like on YouTube, saying this, so you can check it out again later if you choose. I just think, when I look at what we measure to be our own intelligence, and we tend to think highly of it. Getting back to Jim's point, there's a certain hubris just even in how we think about our relationship to the world. And it's understandable, perhaps, even in the search for intelligent life in the universe. It comes with the assumption that we will find life that also thinks we are intelligent. Well, if we look at other life forms on Earth with whom we have DNA in common, there is none that we would rank ever in the history of the fossil record, or life thriving today, that we would rank with us and our level of intelligence. So given our definitions, we're the only intelligent species there ever was, because we have poetry and philosophy and music and art. And then I thought to myself, well, if the chimpanzee has 98% identical DNA to us, pick any animal, doesn't matter, dogs, doesn't matter. Mammals have very close DNA to us. They cannot do trigonometry. Some people can't do trigonometry, certainly not these animals. So if they cannot do trigonometry, and they have such close genetic identity to us, let's take that same gap and put it beyond us, and find some life form that is that much beyond us that we are beyond the dog or the chimp. What would we look like to them? We would be drooling, blithering idiots in their presence. The smartest chimp can do maybe some sign language and stack boxes and reach a banana, put up an umbrella, like our toddlers can do. Our toddlers do that. So maybe the smartest human, you can bring Stephen Hawking forward in front of this other species, and they're chuckling because they'll say, oh, this happens to be the smartest human, because he's slightly smarter than the rest, because he can do astrophysics calculations in his head, like little Timmy over here. Oh, you're back from preschool. Oh, you just composed a symphony. That's so beautiful. Just put it on the refrigerator door. You just derived all the principles of math. Oh, that's cute. And so that is not a stretch to think about. And if that's the case, it is easy for me to imagine that everything in our lives is just the creation of some other entity for their entertainment. It is easy for me to think that. So whatever the likelihood is, 0%, 1%, 17, 42, no answer, I'm saying the day we learn that it is true, I will be the only one in the room saying, I'm not surprised.
How do you think will virtual reality tie in the future of transportation, which you are working on? Thank you.
Well, maybe we're in a simulation right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, seriously. Sometimes it feels like that. Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to, from what I've heard of Oculus Rift and some of the other immersive technologies, that it's quite transformative. You really feel like you're there. and then when you come out of it, it feels like reality isn't real. So I think we'll see probably less physical movement in the future as a result of the virtual reality stuff. Yeah.
And when we come out of what we're here now into this virtual reality, we'll think it's real. I mean, it's like we're...
Well, I mean, there's some interesting things here on the virtual reality front. And, I mean, just on the whole notion of a simulation, which is that if you extrapolate into the future and say, well, how good, let's say, will video games be in 100 or 200 or 1,000 years from now? If there's continued improvement and you're in a full-body haptic suit with a sort of surround vision, and it becomes, beyond a certain resolution, indistinguishable from reality. And there are likely to be millions, maybe billions of such simulations. So then, what are the odds that we're actually in base reality? Isn't it 1 in billions?
Is it? I mean, I can give the counter-argument, but I'd rather you give the counter-argument.
Obviously, this feels real, but it seems unlikely to be real.
Take a look at this. This is the Illustris project, a giant cosmological simulation with the aim of studying the formation and evolution of galaxies. It's an ongoing project in which scientists use the most precise data and calculations currently available to create the most precise model of the universe possible. At its highest resolution, it had a volume of 106.5 cubic megaparsecs, took several months to complete on a supercomputer with 8,192 cores, used 25 terabytes of RAM at its peak, and had a particle count of over 18 billion. Of course, it's only realistic to a certain extent and from a very narrow perspective. The simulation is detailed enough that they can actually zoom in on individual galaxies, but it's not detailed enough to simulate the birth of each individual star or planet, and certainly not the astronomical numbers of individual molecules and atoms and so on. Instead, they have to approximate how a galaxy behaves as a whole without actually simulating all of its individual parts and properties. And once the simulation arrived at present day, the result was strikingly similar to what we observe in the universe.
We may be living in a simulated universe, a computer-generated reality. Evidence number 1, a pixelated universe. Pictures and images are made up of pixels. No matter how high the resolution of an image is, it will still blur as you zoom in further. When you can see each and every individual pixel, it won't matter how much more you focus, because it holds no significance. Zooming further would have no meaning. It would reveal nothing smaller. In the real world, we can zoom down to see bacteria and viruses, then to the level of atoms, quarks, and superstrings, which are the bits and pieces that make up the whole image of reality. But like a computer screen, our reality too has a limit. Beyond Planck's length, which is the real-world equivalent of a single pixel, all sense of space and distance is lost. All meaning of space and distance ceases to exist. And exactly like a computer, our time too is discrete. It isn't continuous. Time isn't one smooth directional arrow, but made up of tiny discrete packets. It acts like the processing of a very fast computer.
This is an argument that tries to show that at least one of 3 propositions is true, although it doesn't tell us which of these 3. The 3 propositions in question is first, that almost all civilizations at our stage of technological development go extinct before they reach technological maturity. So that's the first possibility. A second possibility is that there is a very strong convergence among all technologically mature civilizations, in that they all lose interest in creating ancestry simulations, as I call them. These would be very detailed computer simulations of people like their historical forebears, detailed enough that the simulated people in these simulations would be conscious. So the second possibility is that they just lose interest in doing this. And the third possibility is that we are almost certainly living in a simulation. So there's this argument that shows that one of these three is true. And the full argument involves some probability theory, but the basic idea can be grasped quite simply, which is that suppose it were the case that the first possibility did not obtain. So then some non-trivial fraction of civilizations at our stage eventually reach technological maturity. Then suppose the second possibility also does not obtain. So some non-negligible fraction of those mature civilizations are still interested in using the resources to running ancestry simulations. You can then show that because each mature civilization that devoted some resources to this purpose could run astronomical numbers of ancestry simulations, you can show that if the first two possibilities do not obtain, then there will be many, many more simulated people like us than there will be non-simulated people like us. In other words, almost all people with our kinds of experiences would be living inside simulations rather than outside them, if the first two possibilities are false. And conditional on that, we should therefore think we are probably one of the typical simulated people rather than one of the exceptional non-simulated people. So the structure of the argument then is that if you reject the first two hypotheses, then the third one follows, which then means you can coherently reject all three. That's the structure of the simulation argument. There's a further possibility that if you have a simulated civilization, that simulated civilization might, inside the simulation, develop the technology to run its own simulations. And you might then have a kind of nested simulation. With simulation inside the simulation, you might have many levels of simulation. But that's an optional extra. The basic simulation argument doesn't presuppose that. It's just that if you extrapolate the kind of computing power that an advanced civilization will eventually have, and you figure if they would use some of that immense computing power to running simulations, they could run an astronomical number of them. So therefore, in that scenario, most people with our kinds of experiences would be among the simulated people, because for each original history, there would then be maybe millions or billions of simulated histories.
Max Planck famously said, "There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter." One of the hottest ideas in cosmology is known as the holographic principle. It's the idea that our three-dimensional universe is emerging from 2D information. That is, three-dimensional objects are composed of information spread out on a two-dimensional surface, in the same way that a hologram produces a three-dimensional image from two-dimensional information. The holographic principle tells us something very surprising. It says that our ideas of volume, and in a sense, the world, might be a kind of illusion.
The idea that the universe and reality itself could be a simulation is not something new. We can trace similar ideas as far back as the time of ancient Greece, when numerous philosophers around the world alluded to the idea that reality could be an illusion. Imagine a cave where people have been imprisoned since birth. They are chained in such a way that they are forced to constantly gaze upon the wall in front of them. They cannot look around the cave, at each other, nor at themselves. All they know is this wall and nothing else. Behind them there's a fire, and between the prisoners and the fire there's a walkway. When people walk between the fire and the prisoners, shadows are cast upon the wall. Because the prisoners doesn't know anything else, they believe the shadows to be real, actual entities of their own. And when a passerby is talking, the prisoners believe it to be coming from the shadows themselves. They have no idea that the shadows on the wall are merely lesser copies of reality and falsely assume that this partial reality that they can perceive is the complete truth. There are many interpretations of this allegory which can be applied to a vast range of topics. It can be interpreted as a way of understanding the importance of knowledge and how it shapes reality, or it could be an analogy for human ignorance and our unwillingness to seek truth and wisdom. It could also be read like this. Just like the shadows in this cave, could our perceived reality be a shadow of something else?
Another thing to consider is quantum bits. The fact that light is quantized as photons, electricity as electrons, etc. better fits the hypothesis that we live in a virtual construct. Because in digital processing, all data must have a minimal quantity, represented by bits or pixels, and our world displays the same property. Every computer-generated image breaks down into pixels when examined closely. And this is what science has found in nature. In the past century, physicists have discovered that matter really is quantized, composed of fundamental, indivisible particles billions of times smaller than an atom. And, as science has discovered more and more about the way the universe behaves, it has become clear that nature is a matrix of computable bits.
We exist as information. Matter and energy are inextricably linked. We know that from Einstein's equation E is equal to mc squared. But what we don't realize is that matter and energy are all secondary aspects of reality. They are simply manifestations of the most fundamental of all, information. Everything around us is information. Atoms and molecules are information. The buildings we see around us are physical representations of their blueprints. Genes are information encoded into our DNA. Light and electromagnetic waves are forms of information, like radio waves traveling at the speed of light. The electrical signals racing to and from our brains. That is information. Accepting the fact that our reality is informational, it therefore follows that it will be computable. We seem to see a pattern forming over here. Our universe is pixelated. A matter isn't as real and as solid as we'd hoped. Our reality can be shut down, and we are ultimately informational, virtual beings so comparable to a computer program that it isn't a big jump to accept that we are possibly, no, we are probably living in a computer simulation.
The fossil record, or life thriving today, that we would rank with us and our level of intelligence. So given our definitions, we're the only intelligent species there ever was, because we have poetry and philosophy and music and art. And then I thought to myself, well, if the chimpanzee has 98% identical DNA to us, pick any animal, doesn't matter, dogs, doesn't matter. Mammals have very close DNA to us. They cannot do trigonometry. Some people can't do trigonometry, certainly not these animals. So
I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
I think the likelihood may be very high. And my evidence for it is just, it's a thought experiment, and it's simple. We'll just end with this reflection. And I'm elsewhere, like on YouTube, saying this, so.
Unique is the fact that I'm willing to talk about it. We are living in a computer-programmed reality And the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant. And I will even say this,
you can check it out again later if you choose. I just think when I look at what we measure to be our own intelligence, and we tend to think highly of it. Getting back to Jim's point, there's a certain hubris just even in how we think about our relationship to the world, and it's understandable, perhaps, even in the search for intelligent life in the universe. It comes with the assumption that we will find life that also thinks we are intelligent. Well, if we look at other life forms on Earth with whom we have DNA in common, there is none that we would rank ever in the history